Welcome to my video on finishes. This is going to take you through how I like to protect my designs and my work to make sure it looks as good as it can for as long as possible, and how to get a really good, smooth, hard-wearing finish on your projects. So there's an element of personal choice when it comes to finishes, and so I'm going to be taking you through my personal choice and explain to you why I do it this way and why I think this is a good way to go about particularly protecting masking tape designs. So it might be that you have slightly different ideas about how you want your project to look at the end, and that's absolutely fine. There are different ways to do this. Like I said, I'm just going to show you what works for me, and some of the products that I think are really good for finishing up. It's worth saying that actually quite a lot of us use paints that don't need a top coat. They seal themselves effectively. Unlike something like chalk paint, which has to be sealed with a wax or other top coat to make it durable, a lot of us these days are using furniture paints that don't need a top coat to be resilient by themselves. However, that being said, a lot of them might be matte in appearance, so you might want to put a top coat on like I do because I like a satin finish, or you might want to give it an extra level of protection from that everyday wear and tear in what's called a high traffic area. So things like the fronts of drawers here where fingers might be touching all the time, where you've got the oils off your hands, and maybe your nails, and jewellery and whatever you, cupboard doors, kitchens are another place, in particular where top coats are definitely recommended on top of the paint, just to let it cope with that extra wear and tear. So let's talk about the finishes themselves, the things we have to choose from to put on our furniture to protect it. So we are looking at waxes, oils and top coat stroke varnish. So to my mind, a varnish is an oil-based product. A top coat is a water-based product, and they're both sort of the similar sort of thing that you might brush on. Then you've got a oil, which is going to sink into your surface a little bit more, rather than lying on top like a top coat or varnish might. And then you've got a wax that you might apply and rub in and buff off. So those are the sort of three different kinds, and they range in terms of how long they last and how durable they are. So for me, when it comes to doing my own furniture, I don't use wax and I don't use oil. I don't think that they have the longevity and the long-lasting finish that I want when I'm selling furniture, and that's my personal choice. But and I don't really want to pass something on to my customers that they're going to have to refinish. So oil and wax will have to be reapplied over time. They will also mark and they will have to be replenished to keep looking their best. Now, when I've applied a design to something, I don't then want a customer to then have to worry about how to keep that looking good. Do I just oil this bit? Do I oil this bit? That's not really something I want to put in their hands. I want that to look good for as long as possible. So the other thing about waxes and oils, aside from the fact that I don't want them to have to be reapplied to keep them looking good, is that they're also not as hard wearing as a top coat would be or a varnish would be. It's not creating a film across the top of the surface, so unifying the design with the wood or with the paint and creating one smooth surface, or pretty smooth anyway. Obviously the design is a little bit raised, but if you put lots of coats on and keep sanding in between, you could get a perfectly smooth surface. Not so with oil and wax. That's going to be a completely different surface. You don't have a film across the top. They sink in and leave the design raised, which does mean you could catch it. Particularly if you're using metallics as well, that could scratch. The metallics are a little bit more susceptible to that in the way that they're created, with the sort of mica particles in that the top of the paint isn't quite as firm as example, sort of like a matte colour like this, and you can scratch it. So I like to have something that goes right across and seals everything together as one. Now there's plenty of choices out there in the market. My personal choice, I use General Finishes a lot of the time, if not mostly all the time, simply because it's the most hard wearing, easy to use, quick drying product I've come across. I used to use Polyvine, and I haven't got too many bad things to say about it, but I did find this easier to apply than Polyvine, so that's why I kind of stopped using it. but I would recommend that as a product. General Finish is just my personal choice, really. You'll also see here you've got the Fusion's Tough Coat, which pairs very well with the paint. So I've used Fusion Mineral Paint on my piece here, and I do use that on occasion. There are reasons why I might choose General Finishes matte, for this is a matte product, over Fusion. It has a little bit more flexibility in terms of what I want to do with it, but this is a pretty good product too. You may know of other products. There are other paint brands that have got really good top coats as well, so it's certainly not the only one that's on the market, but it's the one that I find is my go-to. So the next thing to consider when you're choosing your finish for your project is what finish itself you want. What look do you want from the product that you choose? Now, as I mentioned before, I really like satin. I think that becomes from the black shiny legs you get on 1950s furniture. And I just love the way, as you can see here, it brings up the intensity of black and really just brings it to life, whereas when it's matte it can look a little bit dusty. So that's my personal choice. A lot of people like a matte finish. So this is a point where you might sort of choose a different product from me, which is perfectly fine, but it's just understanding that there are different products, and also that different products have sort of drawbacks that you need to be aware of. So for example, just taking aside from waxes and oils right now, we'll talk about top coats. So top coats basically start off as glossy, all of them. And glossy is the hardest wearing of all. So you think about oil-based paint on your skirting boards, that's the toughest thing there is. Now, in order to make something a little bit less shiny, because we don't really always want glossy, do we? To make it a little bit shiny, they add particles into it, which actually stop the light reflecting and make it less shiny. So even a satin, like this here, which is a semi-sheen, will have particles in it to dial down the amount of sheen it's got. That's why you might get sediment in the bottom when you open a can of something like this. Stir it all up and then you get an even distribution, and actually it's super clear. Satin's very, and gloss can be, if it's in the, particularly in water-based, is very forgiving to apply because it just flows out, it's clear. When you get a little bit more matte, so I've got here, well, I've got Fusion's Tough Coat, and I can actually show you here, you can see there, the line of sediment. Now that is the mattifying particles in this product, and those need to be distributed evenly, otherwise we'll end up with shiny. If I just poured out this top section, this would be like a satin top coat. As a tip, if you've got any of this, actually, you can actually get a couple of finishes out of it. But this is the particles here. Now this particular product is a little bit, has tendencies to bubble. So you don't want to be shaking this, you don't even want to squeeze out the spout, you want to take the top off and pour it. And to mix this together, I will roll it, because I don't want to get bubbles in. You never want to get bubbles in your top coats. You just want to stir it, so use a stick in a can, get that sediment mixed really well, but gently. Get it really well mixed in. So flat out flat here is going to have even more particles in, and it's going to give you a really dead flat finish. So those are the sort of range you would get from glossy, semi-gloss, satin, flat or matte, and flat out flat. Now what you've got to be aware of is, as you go down that spectrum, you're getting slightly less hard wearing finish. So your glossy is at the top end, then your satin, then your matte, and your flat out flats, because the more particles it's got in it, the less tough that finish is. One bit of advice is, if you're planning to do a matte finish and it's somewhere high traffic like a kitchen, is to actually put down a couple of coats of satin first to get the best hard wearing finish before you apply your matte. Obviously that means having more product, but it's just something to consider. It will make your finish a lot tougher. When you get down something like flat out flat, it's going to be a marked difference in terms of hard weariness compared to the satin, but yet it will still be tougher than something like wax and more impervious to splashes and scratches. So it's that spectrum, and you need to decide where you want to put the finish on your product. And if it's going to be sitting in a corner by itself with a lamp on, you really don't need to go crazy with it. And some people in my workshops decide they like the look of the paint as it is, they like the look of the effect as it is, maybe the wood tone as it is, and they decide they're just going to leave that alone and not put a finish on it. Because what we need to bear in mind is, as soon as we put a finish on, it may change the character of the thing that we've created. So the wood on this was very pale till I put the top coat on, and then it darkened. And there are ways and means to avoid that happening, but it's something to bear in mind. So you can sort of work that out. I mean, I tend to use something like White Spirit just to go over my wood to get a sense of what colour it's going to be, which might mean I want to stain it, if it's still a little bit too light or it's not quite the tone that I want. But when people often say, I don't want it to go any darker, it's a good idea to try that. Better that than using water, because you're going to get it with raising the grain, which means you've got to sand it again, so you kind of go around in circles. But it's a good idea to try that, because that will give you a sense of what it's going to look like when it's finished. When you put your finish on, it literally wets the surface and darkens it. So there are products out there that will stop that happening. They've actually got white in them, and they will keep your surface looking very pale. So let me just show you this. So this is a sample board, and it's actually got a sliding spectrum here, as you can see, very, very pale, and the wood is almost as if it was unfinished, but this has actually got a raw oil on it, so it's got no colour in it. All the way over here to this is oil, and you can see how oil really darkens and brings out the colour and the grain of the wood. But as you can see where the light's bouncing here, it provides virtually no finish. So it's not providing a protective layer. So you wouldn't want to put that necessarily on a tabletop. So this is my favourite here. You can just see it catching the light. General Finishes Satin. That's the sort of level of sheen it is. And then next to it is, let me just make sure I've got this the right way around. General Finishes Matte. Yes. Oh no, that's the General Finishes Satin there. Apologies. That's the satin. You can see it does add a level of colour to the wood that this one doesn't hit over here. This is the plain. Now this one here, sitting between the oil and the General Finishes Satin, so that's a top coat which doesn't colour you can see it doesn't colour the white. It's non-yellowing, so you can use that over pale colours. You can get a nice bit of nourishment for your wood. That's why it's the all-rounder for me. Sort your wood out, and you can put it over any kind of paint, and you get a nice smooth surface with a little bit of sheen. This one next to it is a product you might not be aware of, and it's called Endurovar. And you can see it actually it's actually amber in tone. So it has changed the colour of the white. So you wouldn't want to use that if you didn't want ambering. But what it does do is bring a nice warm tone to the wood, just like the oil, but giving it a protective finish. You can actually get this in flat as well, so you wouldn't necessarily have to have it shiny like this. But what you're doing is getting slightly more nourished warmth to the wood, almost as if it was oiled or an oil-based varnish, than maybe this cooler top coat. So those are the couple of things that I might sort of bounce between in terms of getting protection on my finishes. So this is Endurovar here, and this is High Performance Satin here, both by General Finishes. And I'll just show you the difference so you get a feel for it. And my bottle opener, and my can opener rather. These things are incredibly important when you come to using tins, because otherwise you just stretch out the rims. So this is the Endurovar, and you may just be able to see in there, try not to pour it on the floor, that it is actually amber in colour. So that's why you get that. You can actually see around the edge. So it looks like an old-fashioned varnish, but it's water-based, and it washes up water-based, which is what we want. I don't want to be working with oil-based finishes. If we can help it, it's not so good for your health, not so good for the environment, and just rubbish to wash up from. You have to use White Spirit to wash up your brushes, or you end up throwing them away. So at least with water-based, you can always clean up quite easily. And so that's your, oh, that's flat out flat. I've opened the wrong tin. That's flat out flat, but can you see that's white? It's the same. It starts off white and dries clear. So that's the difference between them. That's why that's much cooler in tone over the wood. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how oil darkens the wood, and we've said that the Endurovar is a good product for giving you that level of protection that natural oils don't give you, because they don't provide a protective layer that's going to unify and protect your metallic from scratching and those edges from catching. Now what about if you want to keep your wood looking pale? So you can see at the bottom here, I've got some mattes. It's the difference in colour between an oil, this is hemp oil, and this is Flat Out Flat. That's the flattest, mattest top coat, and you can see how pale it's made the wood, and you can see it doesn't catch the light really at all. So that won't be as tough as some of these finishes up here, but you can see it's making a really nice light effect on the wood. So that's something you could choose. This is just the matte, so it's got a little bit more shine. And then this is Pollux Oil Raw, which has got white in it, which makes it even cooler. But I actually think the Flat Out Flat's probably coolest of all in terms of keeping the wood light. But that's another option. However, that doesn't create as much of a film over the top because Pollux Oil sort of sinks into the wood a lot more rather than sitting on top. So the one thing just to bear in mind while I'm showing you here is that the mattifying particles of a top coat like this will dull down a metallic. So the mattified particles will stop the metallic catching the light in a sort of sparkly way. They'll catch the light, you can see they sort of look a bit metallic-y, but they look metallic coloured. It stops those little particles glistening and twinkling because it deadens them, stops the light catching them. So it's just something to bear in mind, which is why I don't use matte very much, if at all, over a metallic. And if a customer wants it, I would try and advise them to put satin over this part and over the wood to get the most out of it, to enhance the wood as much as possible, to enhance the metallic, and then maybe go for matte on some of the other areas, the bigger areas, if they really, really wanted to dull down that shine. So those are the sort of conversations I'd have. So before we move on to application and actually getting that top coat on, I'll just pause to mention another product that you might like to try, and it's Fusion Stain and Finishing Oil. Now this is oil based, so I said I'm not a massive fan of oil based, you've got the fumes and the wash up from it, you end up throwing stuff away. But this will create, this will sink into the wood and nourish it, and can go over the paint as well. Now, like all oils, you do wipe it back, but it can help to create a little bit of a tougher surface. And this is the natural one. So obviously, that's the one you're going to want if you're going over design. And that won't do anything to your paint. It works very well with the paint. It just ever so slightly provides a tougher sort of finish across it, but it also sinks into the wood as well. So that's another one you could give a try to. And actually, with all of the things I'm talking about here, what I would suggest if you aren't sure what it's going to look like would be to try it on a bit of wood. Put your paint down, even do a little bit of pretend design if you need to, just so you can get a look at the effect and how it changes when you've got your finish on. It's worth taking the effort till you've got in your head the products that you like to work with the best. You don't want to have to try and take something off afterwards. Okay, let's talk about application now. Now it's fairly straightforward until you get to the large surfaces. So when it comes to things like the legs and these like little ledges here, I'm just going to use one of my paintbrushes. So nice, soft, fine paintbrush, square paintbrush like that. And I'm just going to paint it on very smoothly. Let's just do a little bit. Remove him. And what I tend to do is I decant my top coat out into these Tupperware containers. You'll see in a second why, because they fit really well when you're using an applicator. But it's also a good idea with top coats to decant a small amount as you go, just like you would with paint, but even more so with top coat, because you'll find that'll get contaminated. Heaven knows where they all come from, but the bits that come out the air when you start top coating. Black is obviously much more forgiving, but if you start to top coat over light colours, you'll see what I mean. And that's why little tips I could give you would be to not top coat somewhere with a lot of soft furnishings, carpets. If you can, wear light colours. If you're top coating light colours, wear light colours, because a little bit of black fluff will come off your clothes and pet hairs. So somewhere, just keep the doors closed, somewhere, like I say, without too many carpets, and tie your hair back if you've got long hair. That's another thing. Just makes top coating a little bit less stressful, but it will happen. And it's just the law of the jungle, I think, when it comes to top coating. So black's a lot more forgiving than that. And as I said, this is because it's white, goes on clear though, because you put it on thin enough. She says putting loads on, put it on thin enough, and it should just look wet on the surface. If it does look white, it's bunched up and you just need to smooth it out some more. So all I need to do is make sure that's wet. And then the same with painting, don't go over it too many times. Just want to get it wetted. Nice thin coat, so I don't want to see any white build up. does level out very well, this one, so it's very forgiving. And it dries very quickly. This will be dry, well, dry to the touch in about 10 minutes actually. But like everything that we work with in refinishing, it's going to need 21 days to get really, really hard, for all the water to evaporate out and to give it its toughest surface possible. So I would always say to people that are taking delivery of something, just to be a little bit gentle with it to start with. Place things, don't push them around, drag them around until it's reached its full hardness, basically. So that's pretty straightforward. Now the challenge is always, how do we get these lovely glossy tops? Now you can probably see I've got a coat on this already, and I've given it, let's move that down, given it one coat I think, possibly. Now if I'm going to top coat, I'll always give that a little whiz over with the synthetic sanding pad just to smooth it, and then I'll go on with the top coat. And so in between coats I then go for superfine synthetic sanding pad. So you could use a 400, 600 sanding paper, and I just do that because you will find you can feel a little grittiness, really. It's bits in the air, settle on the surface, and you just want to denib basically, just lightly with this. And you'll see where it gathers. I'll tip it in a second actually. You'll see where it gathers. The little spots here are just little bits that I've just taken off, smoothed down, so just little tiny bits of grit. And obviously if you've got anything standing up in your finish, you can give it a bit of an extra attention. But this just helps to create a super smooth finish. And obviously if I'm doing this over the design here, once this has got a couple of layers on, smooth sanding over the top of that is going to start to get a really nice smooth finish. Mine's only got one at the moment, so you can still really feel the ridge, but as the coats build up, you could get that very smooth. I tend to only go to 3, so you can still feel the design a little bit, but you could keep going if you wanted to. And then I'll get the tap cloth, which is the little resin impregnated rag. I'm trying to open it out, but it won't let me, so let's not faff. And then we'll just lightly, very lightly, no rubbing, dust over the top and pick up that fine sanding dust. And that's ready to top coat. So in terms of applicators, there's quite a variety of things you can use, and I think most of them are quite easy to get hold of. Now I would always have sworn by one of these, which is a special applicator for floors, for wooden floors, and it's got a lovely soft flock. Now it's worth looking at this, because if you spot anything out and about that looks like that, it is actually called nano flock. Then that's look for that kind of thing. But what's good about it is it's actually built on a very shallow sponge, so it can hold liquid, but not too much, and it doesn't. It's quite firm, and you can get a nice, consistent, smooth surface with it. So I might use that, I might not. So what can you use instead? So I've got some ideas for you, because these things, they are amazing, but they're not very easy to get hold of. So they've become a cult item. So these are pretty good. These come in a pack of 2 in most supermarkets, called Dishmatic. And what you'll notice is, hopefully, is it's very fine gauge sponge. So the holes are very small. That's a really good way of to apply your top coat. You just have to be careful not to squeeze down too much with those, but the corners are really helpful for getting into areas, and it doesn't create bubbles because it's so fine. So I like those. They're a good choice. A lot of people swear by these, and I've had okay luck with them. You just have to hold it in a certain way. And this is a microfiber cloth covered sponge. So you can get those in a pack of 3 for only a couple of quid. You know, they're not expensive, and you can get them in most of the home stores. And you're just literally wiping on with those. Again, you have to be careful not to squeeze too hard. You do build up that sort of knack. It's the same with painting, just that sort of light sort of go over. And you can kind of get the feel for it after a while. You could also try, these are Gen poly brushes. These are the original poly brushes, as opposed to the foam brushes that you might get in sort of hobby shops and eBay. These are very, very fine gauge sponge again, can you see? So that's why they don't create bubbles. And they're also very firm. They have a support right inside here. And they're much, much better made than the really cheap ones. So you can smooth on your top coat. So I've had good luck with those as well. And they come in different sizes. These are great for stains, and I also use them for oiling as well. So I do use oil on wood, and I would say if you've got a mid-century piece and you wanted to keep it, you know, appropriate to its age, I would oil it. It's just really when I'm working with designs and paint. I mean, putting oil over paint it doesn't do anything. You're just going to wipe it back. It doesn't sink in. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. It doesn't add any protection. So, but I do oil, and I tend to use oil a lot to refresh the wood around that. So inside, it's really nice to bring the rest of the cabinets back to life, and inside the drawers, and nourish them again. So I might use something like this, and they last a long time and they wash up well. Whereas the cheap ones, you'd have to chuck them away. So they're a good option. You could try those. Like I say, you can use them for paint, you can use them for oil, you can use them for stain. And then I've got this. So some people roller their finishes. Now, I don't tend to, except in one instance, which is to use, when I'm using matte top coat over dark colours. I would use a very fine finishes roller, like this. This is a Harris one, or Two Fussy Blokes. Their rollers do a good job too. Because matte top coats, because of the mattifying particles, when you lay them down in another way with a brush or an applicator like this, it can leave those particles looking uneven, so it effectively gives you streaks. And that's one reason why I wouldn't use this over darks. It does even say on the bottle itself that it can cause cloudiness and streakiness over dark colours because of the amount of mattifying particles that are in it. This is the instance where I would use the General Finishes flat, and this is flat out flat, but I'd use the flat, which is a little bit sheenier, and then I'd roller it on because it provides a really even distribution of those mattifying agents across the surface, and then it levels off. Now, it's not as smooth as this, but it's pretty damn good. And so that's the only thing I've found that would get around the matte over darks thing, if you've ever come across that. In all my experiments, that's the best way to handle it and wear off. So the final applicator I'm going to show you is this. And it's a whiteboard eraser. And so you can see it's got a very fine brush, a small amount of sponge, and a solid base, a bit like the applicator I showed you at the beginning. So I'm going to use this one. These are only a couple of quid, but do give you quite a nice fine finish. So all I do is dip it in and then take off the excess on the rim. Not too much off, because otherwise you'll have nothing on your pad. And then I'm going to start at one side and just drag it back. And slightly go over once, and try not to go over too many times. Now I'm just going to slightly blend that in. It might start to run out of product, so I'm going to go back in again. I'm putting a bit of pressure on here just to get that product out of the sponge into the brush bit. It's just starting to run out a little bit, so I'll do it again. And then just smooth that. And that's not bad. Now what I'll do straight away is I'll go around the edges and just check for dribbles. Now you might see that I've got a bit here where I've missed. That's fine, I can catch that on the next coat. So you get there little by little. So I'm going to smooth that bit in actually. I might actually, seeing as it hasn't dried up straight away, it does dry pretty quickly though. Okay, just check for dribbles. All good. And then leave that to dry. Make sure it's touch dry before you recoat. And like I said, I'd do 3 coats, but you can certainly go a little bit more than that into 4 if you wanted to. Just brought you around to the end of this same piece for a little close up. This hasn't actually been top coated yet. So you can see the different sort of slightly dusty nature of the black without the satin top coat on. And also this wood is slightly paler because it hasn't been top coated yet. So it's all still quite rough. And you can feel the difference between the pattern and the wood underneath. So I'm going to put a top coat on. And I'm going to use the microfiber covered sponge applicator this time, just to give it a bit of a variety, so you can see how that works. And what you'll actually see a little bit better here is that I will be going in the same direction as the grain when I'm adding the top coat over the top. Just the same as I would when I'm painting, so I always do everything in the same direction. So I'm just going to do that, dip it in, let it soak in a little bit because the sponge is inside a cloth with this one. And I'm just going to remove the excess. And then, now this is a bit harder to control because it's not as flat, but I'm just going to push that and not push too hard. Smooth that down. I've got a little over the edge there. So I might just wobble off a bit backwards and forwards there. Picked up a little tiny bit of dried top coat there, so you can just pick those out quite easily with your finger. Just going over it a few times, but not too many. So, you could just go in there with a brush, of course. And then I'll get a little refill. Just go along the top there, actually. This has got a bit of a raw wood edge under there, so it's possibly not the best one to have chosen. But I just wanted to show how the different things, as long as there's that sort of sponge element so it can hold some of the top coat in, but not dispense it out too quickly. So it's a little bit, like I say, about getting the sort of feel for it, and how hard to push, and how often to replenish as well. A little bit of wood there that's come down from the top. There you go. One thing it's worth pointing out actually is if you've stained the wood before you've done a design over it, it's a really good idea to top coat that area first, just with one coat. So you'd have to tape off again, because what you don't want is that stain to drag down over your paint when you're pulling the applicator down. It wouldn't be so bad over the black here. It probably would show over a gold, but it certainly would show over mid to light colours. So you want to get that sealed first. So you'd have to do one coat over the top, and then you can do a full coat over after that, and it should hold fine. So once I've got a couple of coats on like this, that's when I'll start using the fine sanding pad to really smooth some of the sort of the ridges where the paint lies on the surface, and to make it a really nice smooth finish. I won't go in with it too quickly because with only one coat on I might accidentally scratch the metallic here, which I don't want to do. So I'll put a couple on before I actually start to sort of go in and smooth that, so it feels a bit nicer to the touch. It's not quite so rough on the edges. If I'm going straight over paint, so I would give that 20 minutes or so at least before I put any more top coat on it. And as I said, I do 3 coats. You can always do more if you want to sort of perfect your finish. I always do the synthetic sanding pad in between, just to smooth really. And like I said before, make sure you give that 21 days. If you're staging or if you're sending it out to somebody, just tell them to be really careful. As I said, lift things rather than push things on the top, and give it time to really get hard and nice and cured. So just to recap the products that I would use when I'm refinishing, my go-to is General Finishes High Performance in Satin, the most hard-wearing finish, with not too much sheen. I also use their Flat, which has a lot less sheen. It's not flat matte, so I might use a flat out flat for that if I wanted to. I also use Endurovar, which is the varnish, the oil varnish look, which ambers, so it's not going to be colourless like the other top coats. That would be a go-to. If I'm going to oil, I might use a boiled linseed oil, which you have to be quite careful of. If you don't wipe it back quick enough, within sort of 20 minutes, let the first lot of oil sink in, wipe it back before it goes sticky, and you will eventually build up a nice finish. Other oils like hemp, for example, are much more forgiving because they don't dry like this does, so they would just sit there and you can wipe them back at any point. The only thing is they don't give as much protection as something like a boiled linseed oil because it's slightly more treated. So this is a good one to go to for a little bit more protection. Hemp oil doesn't really give you as much. I have also used something like butcher's block oil or orange oil to refresh, as well as hemp oil, to refresh the inside of my furniture, so to give that wood a nice nourished look, but without it necessarily needing an actual finish on it. It just sort of feeds the wood rather than giving you a sort of a shine. So that's it really. All you need to do is find yourself a decent applicator in the shops, and they don't cost a lot, and it's worth having a bit of a play around till you find something you're comfortable with that you can get a good effect with. It takes a little bit of practice, but it's worth it when you get to a lovely sheen like that in the end. Now, if you've got any questions, if you need any support with getting a really good finish on your piece, please feel free to message me, email me at nikki@dunlopnorth.com. Right, I'll see you again soon.